Three generations have grown up, and 60 years have passed since the catastrophic flood of 1955 wreaked havoc within a 6-state region, taking lives and destroying property. Let's revisit the circumstances that led up to this event, the places affected, the human agony encountered, the bravery, self-sacrifice, and resiliency of individuals and communities in their recovery from such a disaster. Let's also explore the planning initiatives created to prevent a similar event in the future and what has been or needs to be accomplished within floodplain areas. Yes, indeed, August 19th, 1955 was Connecticut's Black Friday. The early summer of 1955 had witnessed a hot and dry summer in the New England area. Community water bans and conservation techniques were initiated to address the widespread drought-like conditions. The ground became parched and sunbaked and hardened like cement. However, when nearly 2 inches of rain fell during a 24-hour period in early August, Bristol residents, as well as citizens in other communities, were able to water their lawns, top off their backyard swimming pools, and utilize water for other non-essential purposes. Because the hardened ground surface absorbed only part of the precipitation, an odd, even street address system for water usage remained in effect. A significant part of the rainfall ran off to local brooks, streams, and rivers. 2 weeks later, in mid-August, Connecticut was placed on alert as Hurricane Connie, which had battered the East Coast, especially in North Carolina, was taking a direct path to New England. Conditions were primed for a Connecticut landfall. On Saturday, August 13th, reports coming from the New York City metropolitan area indicated strong wind damages and an accompanying onslaught of significant rainfall. Connecticut, however, would be spared and given a 6-day reprieve as the hurricane veered to the east over the Atlantic Ocean. Before leaving, Connie deposited between 4 to 6 inches of rain on the Connecticut landscape. On Thursday, August 18th, it was reported that Hurricane Diane, the 4th tropical storm of the season, would arrive in the New England area simply as a wet and windy storm. After sucking up significant Atlantic Ocean moisture, Diane's hurricane status was downgraded to a tropical storm. A Bristol Press page 1 headline read, "Diane stops blowing and turns to tears. Winds dissipate on long trip overland." Rains were expected in Connecticut, but damaging winds were ruled out. To our north, Winsted and Torrington received over 2 inches of rain within a 4-hour period on the morning of August 18th. This prompted Torrington's mayor, William Carroll, to declare a state of partial emergency, asking Governor Abraham Ribicoff for assistance. The same rainstorm would continue the entire day in the Waterbury area. Perhaps this was just an omen of what was to come. The early rains of August, combined with the 6 inches deposited by Connie, had made western Connecticut uplands extremely soggy, leaving little absorbency for the rainfall from Diane. Waters cascaded into the nearest valleys and low-lying areas, approximately 14 to 20 inches, and in some areas more, would fall within a 36-hour period. The torrential rainfalls from the aftermath of Diane swelled picturesque, quaintly named rivers such as the Blackberry, Farmington, French, Housatonic, Mad, Naugatuck, Pequabic, Quinnebog, Sheepog, and Still rivers. These rivers that usually supplied solitude, beauty, and recreation took on enormous volumes of water. The Naugatuck, serving as an example, became a funnel for an inconceivable burden of over 1 million gallons. All state rivers and their tributaries experienced massive quantities of excess water and spilled over into the surrounding areas. People who had gone to bed early the evening of August 18th would be lulled to sleep by the drumming of rainfall on the roofs and had little knowledge of what lurked outside in the night's darkness. Those who were traveling about around 10 p.m. that evening would begin to notice a significant accumulation of water on local streets, but were unaware of the nightmare that Mother Nature was creating. People would awaken to the worst natural disaster to ever occur on the East Coast. Not even the horrific hurricane of 1938 would compare to the devastation encountered. This flood was written up by local media as the worst flood since Noah. Numerous lives would be lost and over $1.5 billion of physical assets would be destroyed. The devastation from the flood of 1955 began to our north in Massachusetts. Traveling at over 50 miles per hour, the rampaging torrents pushed aside everything in its path and took anything it wanted, with no regard for human life or property. Scenes from Holyoke, Northampton, Oxford, Southbridge, and Worcester demonstrate the destructive forces of nature. Two other New England states, Connecticut and Rhode Island, would experience the same brutal assault. This first scene is from Manville, Rhode Island, while the second shows a Woonsocket cemetery completely destroyed. Many caskets were seen being carried away by the raging waters. In the Mid-Atlantic area, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania would suffer a similar fate. Flood and shelter scenes from Scranton and Yardley, Pennsylvania, indicate the wide area of destruction. Connecticut suffered the most significant damage in the six-state area. 67 of the state's 169 communities were severely impacted. City blocks were inundated by floodwaters, as shown in typical pictures from Ansonia, Derby, Naugatuck, Seymour, Torrington, Waterbury, Watertown, and Unionville. Winsted, Waterbury, Putnam, and the Farmington Valley towns were the four hardest hit areas. These images from Winsted show how the Mad River on the left went berserk, destroying homes, businesses, commercial properties, utilities, and streets. These Waterbury headlines tell the story of the tremendous carnage to the Brass City's landscape and citizens. The complete devastation of neighborhoods, industry, city buildings and structures, and streets can be seen. Putnam, an old milling town in eastern Connecticut, suffered some of the worst damages and true dichotomy during the unprecedented destruction. The Quinnebog and French rivers conspired to destroy this community. Ironic within this city, as it was being devastated by floodwaters, it also had buildings burning to the ground. A magnesium manufacturing concern was located here. When water mixes with this element, it becomes extremely volatile. Flaring canisters could be seen exploding into the air as if on the 4th of July, or floating on the water, setting other structures on fire. This entire company was destroyed. Other scenes from Putnam include the raging water, destroyed industrial facilities, and other generalized damages. The usually calm Farmington River proved to be a mortal enemy to several communities along its path. The Burlington Inn is shown surrounded by water. The familiar Unionville Bridge leading to the center of town is inundated and later can be seen with a home precariously leaning on its bank. Further to the north, a small architect's office was swept 1 mile down the river in Collinsville, and a home hangs precariously on the embankment. Damage and flooding conditions are evident at the Simsbury hydroelectric station. Transportation became difficult both during and after the floodwaters receded. Cities became divided as steel and concrete bridges collapsed as the rampaging waters undermined and battered their structures. Almost every community within the flood area experienced these losses. Serving as example, Collinsville, Forestville, Putnam, Satan's Kingdom in New Hartford, Thomaston, and Waterbury. Railroad tracks and bridges also fell prey to the avalanche of swift-moving currents and battering debris. In the Naugatuck Valley alone, 36 miles of tracks became inoperable and required replacement. These views from a variety of communities demonstrate the mammoth assault wrought upon the railroad system. Derby, Farmington, Naugatuck, Simsbury, and Waterbury. The quickly moving torrents also inundated and gouged the blacktop or concrete surfaces and understructures of streets and highways, making them inoperable. Often, there were cave-ins due to the undermining action of the flood. Many streets were also covered with large piles of debris. Barnes and Jacob Street in Bristol showed extensive street damage, while 2 trucks became involved in street cave-ins. Mother Nature treated all types of vehicles with the same disdain as she did the transportation networks. All types of vehicles were tossed aside, submerged, or carried along with the raging currents, as if they were mere children's toys. The flood destroyed all types of buildings, both old and new, as it rampaged through communities. Foundations were undermined, and buildings were broken up and floated away. Several historic relics were so damaged that they needed to be demolished. Amongst these were the early Gilbert Clock Shop of Winston, the Central Hotel in Torrington, and the Forest House in Forestville. State and private resources were immediately marshaled as the magnitude of the flood became evident. Army, Navy, and Sikorsky helicopters out of Stratford were deployed for rescue missions for stranded rooftop and debris floating victims. At the Chase Metal Works in the Waterville section of Waterbury, over 300 night shift workers were removed from the roofs by helicopters. Similar life-saving operations were being conducted throughout the state. The helicopters also brought necessities, including food and medical supplies. The Connecticut National Guard's 169th Infantry Regiment, which included Company L of Bristol, were quickly called into action by Governor Abraham Ribicoff. They would assist with rescue, maintaining order, patrolling, traffic control, and the prevention of looting. Company L was responsible for saving a man's life near School Street as he was hanging onto a pole as the rushing 5 or 6 feet of water attempted to drive him downstream. Company L would be stationed in Forestville, Bristol, Thomaston, and Unionville. As during any disaster, the can-do and generous spirit of community togetherness and genuine caring becomes evident. Private citizens, volunteer firemen, police, and others man rowboats and motorboats and set out to reach stranded neighbors, risking their own lives while doing so. People also turned to their faith to pray for the injured, those in jeopardy, and those who were lost. The Red Cross, Salvation Army, and Civil Defense, as well as other social and church organizations, quickly mobilized to assist displaced victims with shelter, food, clothing, finance, and other necessities. Some flood victims had lost everything but the clothing that they were wearing. The sun came out around noon, bringing a beautiful summer day. Little streams were returning to the customary babbling trickles, and rivers assumed their former postures. People ventured out from their homes to see for themselves the aftermath of what Mother Nature had wrought on their community. What they saw, they would never forget. Though sadness, anger, and despair were obvious, the resiliency of the affected communities became more obvious as they immediately chipped in to begin to clear the muck, mire, and debris left behind. Because the floodwaters contained sewage, waste, and other contaminants, a voluntary typhoid inoculation program was instituted. It was suggested that anyone touching anything from the floodwaters be inoculated. People quickly availed themselves of this opportunity. Governor Abraham Ribicoff immediately visited most flood areas, and President Dwight Eisenhower declared the area a federal disaster zone. Federal and state disbursement of funds and assistance for recovery began to arrive almost immediately. Army Corps of Engineers went to the World War II storage depots and immediately began to install temporary bridges utilized during World War II to reunite divided cities. These were constructed in most communities. Putnam and Forestville serve as examples. Death tolls began to rise as the waters receded, and citizens began to clear the devastation left behind. There were tragic stories, such as people waiting for 4 hours on a rooftop in Waterbury, and just before rescue, being swept away. A mother having her baby ripped out of her arms by the swirling currents, and a rescued woman from Thomaston lost as the rescue boat capsized. 91 people died in this tragedy, and another 12 were never located, bringing the figure to over 100. If it wasn't for the quick marshaling of resources and the spirits of communities coming together, these figures certainly would have been much greater. It is certainly ironic that the flood of 1955, despite the high loss of life and the tremendous devastation of property, also brought about positive gains to personnel involved, and was also the prime agent for the transformation and revitalization of old, worn-out milling towns such as Collinsville and Putnam. Governor Abraham Ribicoff later became Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare in the Kennedy administration, and John Dempsey, Mayor of Putnam, became governor. The final report of the Connecticut Flood Recovery Committee was issued on November 3, 1955. 91 people died as a result of this flood, and an additional 12 were missing and considered lost. The cities with the highest casualties can be seen on this chart, as well as the losses to homes and families. The second chart demonstrates the financial losses to industrial facilities, commercial properties, farms, public property, and dams. The disastrous flood of 1955 certainly created a need for implementation of new and creative planning, as well as construction, to assure that a similar event would never occur in the future. $70 million were allocated in Connecticut for the construction of flood walls and dams. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was placed in charge of these building efforts. In the local area, the Thomaston Dam, built in 1960, and the Northfield Dam, constructed in 1965, were designed to control conditions along the Naugatuck River. A similar project, the Colebrook Dam, completed in 1969, was directed at the control of the west branch of the Farmington River. Other changes included adding river monitoring equipment to measure the depth of local rivers. This equipment was neglected prior to the flood of 1955 because of national fiscal restraints. Within communities, continual development was accounting for less watershed property. Improved zoning laws were inaugurated in order to assure less river runoff. Many cities, including Bristol, created river diversion programs to keep waters away from high-density areas, or they utilized underground conduits to control river flow. This is still a debated topic within our city, as many residents favor the aesthetic river views within our community. Cities such as Bristol instituted floodplain controls to assist neighborhoods frequently inundated with flooding. 60 years later, the battle continues against river flooding. A recent May 15, 2015, Bristol Press article urged that $5 million worth of spending is needed to combat high waters along the Pequabic River, the Coppermine River, and their tributaries. During heavy rains, these rivers overflow their banks, filling basements, closing roads, and causing costly living problems for those living alongside the streams. The Boulevard area, Broad Street, the center of Forestville, East Main Street, Farmington Avenue, Frederick Street, the Park Street area, and the Route 72 connector terminus serve as some examples. The flood of 1955 has come and gone, but the problems continue. A constant vigilance is required to keep our community safe and to assist its citizens in being secure from floodwaters. The flood of 1955 in Bristol was primarily caused by the raging Pequabic River. Running west to east, it traveled a path of destruction from Terryville town line eastward to Plainville. The Coppermine Brook and several smaller tributaries, besides flooding some local areas as they traveled, dumped considerable water into the Pequabic River, thus contributing to its devastating forces. Bristol suffered 3.5 million of damages to buildings, properties, and bridges. Fortunately, our city did not experience any loss of life. Let's begin our journey along its path. This image is from Terryville Road, looking east toward the Moose Club and Nettie's Drive-In. The Moose Club is now shown. These scenes demonstrate the destruction of Joe Carucci's sign painting business and his truck submerged in water. Looking to the south, we see Nettie's Drive-In, a favorite eating establishment prior to 1955. This picture shows the washout of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford railroad tracks. This happened in many communities. The final view on Terryville Road is near the Pepsi-Cola Bottling Company and the entrance to Rockwell Park. Let's now enter Rockwell Park and view the flooding damages. These are flooding scenes within Rockwell Park. We now see beach scenes after the flooding. The final scenes are of the Jacob Street entrance to Rockwell Park. The floodwaters coming from the Pequabic River behind Rockwell Park significantly damaged the surrounding area. Let's first look at the destruction of the Jacob Street Bridge. We now see cars submerged or leaning precariously on Jacob Street. These are scenes on Barnes Street, near Muzzy Field. We now see an image of cars on Muzzy Street. These two scenes are on Park Street near Tulip Street. And finally, we see backyard scenes on Park Street. The west end of Bristol suffered significant flood damage, with waters often being 5 to 6 feet deep. These first images are at the intersection of Park Street and Divinity Street. We are now looking toward the west end from Divinity Street. We now travel to Chestnut Street or Chestnut Street at the intersection of West Street. This is a scene from Orchard Street. These images on West Street, looking north, include the destruction of the West Street Bridge and also the undermining of Dunn's funeral home. Included are also pictures from the backyard of Dunn's funeral home and scenes about reconstruction that would be necessary. This scene on West Street shows a chicken coop from Park Street caught up in the raging waters and deposited in front of Alexander's. Traveling further north, we see the amount of water at the intersection of Gaylord and Meadow with West Street. This is where St. Anne Church and Emmanuel Lutheran Church are presently located. Turning further east, we travel up Laurel Street and to the A&P store, and across the street, the Bristol store. Returning to the west end and looking in the direction of School Street, we see the devastating waters from Novak's Pharmacy at the corner of Divinity Street. The West End diner seen in these images had to be demolished because of undermining by flood waters. From the West End corner, the torrents of water continued their rampage down School Street toward the center of town. One man's life was saved by quick National Guard action. The waters flowed over the Church Street Bridge, leaving debris, and continued toward Main Street, flooding stores on its way. These images show the debris cleanup needed at School Street stores and the South Side School. The floodwaters continued to Main Street, where they flooded parts of Lower Main Street. The Bristol Press and Bristol Diner, and across the street, the Center Block. The rampage continued down the boulevard past W.T. Grant. The Bristol Press, despite being flooded, published the next day. The floodwaters inundated the entire length of the Memorial Boulevard. Pictured here is the Bristol High School of 1955. These images show the area of the World War I monument. Further down the street, we see a policeman on duty. At the intersection of Riverside Avenue and a boulevard, we witness the flood of Down Street, near the old Bristol Tramway gas tanks and the Downs Mill marker. The rampaging Pequabic River continued its path along Broad Street on its way to destroy the Forestville Center. These scenes on Broad Street show the Outdoor Sports Company, the Preston Street Bridge, and a damaged car on Preston Street. Several views of the Walls Barnes Mill on Broad Street are shown, from both the Broad Street side or the Frederick Street entrance. Munn's Garage near the Forestville Center is also shown after the floodwaters receded. The Pequabic River completely inundated the Forestville Center, causing extensive damage, from which this area of town never recovered. These are panoramic views of the village, showing the extensive amount of flooding involved. The Broad Street intersection with Central Street was on the edge of the Pequabic River. This was originally the location of the Forrest House, and later the Forestville Confectionery ran by the Ziotis family. This is now the location of the Thomas Quinlan Memorial Park. These scenes are looking toward the famous Johnny's Restaurant and the area where the Forestville Pharmacy once stood, but was completely destroyed and carried down the river toward Plainville. The Forestville Bridge in front of Johnny's restaurant was completely destroyed as the raging torrents and debris battered its structures. These images show the Central Street stores in the Forestville Center. These scenes show East Main Street, which became completely covered with floodwaters. The Sessions Clock Company on East Main Street is also shown. The Coppermine Brook was also involved in the flooding. Running from Burlington west and parallel to Stafford Avenue, it crosses Farmington Avenue near Mick Street. These scenes show the flooding caused at this intersection. The Coppermine continues to run west of Brook Street and Stafford Avenue and dumps its waters into the Pequabic River near Frederick Street. This scene shows the flooded Louisiana Avenue Bridge. This is the Humison Company off of Stafford Avenue during the Coppermine Brook flooding. Flooding and disasters due to the significant rainfall were obvious in other parts of the city. A daring rescue took place by firemen and policemen at 6 a.m. at the home of Paulette Houle on Jerome Avenue near Shrub Road. She and her 2 children had been stranded in the backyard as rushing waters surrounded them and washed away their footing. Amongst the losses within the city was the home occupied by Herman and Minnie Bursler. This house was owned by Edwin and Valerie Sandstrom at 56 and 58 George Street. The home collapsed after rising waters undermined its foundation. They had been warned to vacate the premises as a gradual tilting had been noticed. Yes, Connecticut, Bristol, and the other areas affected suffered a crippling blow during the flood of 1955, but we managed to survive and thrive.